In this episode of the Well Aware podcast, host Dr. Lauren Grawert, Chief Medical Officer at Aware Recovery Care, sits down with Joseph D. Bernard, a nationally recognized operating under the influence defense attorney, to explore the critical intersections between the legal system, medical treatment, and addiction recovery. Together, they discuss common misconceptions about addiction within both the legal and medical fields. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Well Aware podcast. I'm Dr. Lauren Grawert, the Chief Medical Officer here at Aware Recovery Care. Today, we're going to be talking about how the medical and the legal fields intersect in the space of addiction. And I am so excited to be joined by Joseph D. Bernard, who is not only an attorney, but an OUI defense expert, which stands for Operating Under the Influence. For those of you who do not know, Joseph, I feel like calling you Joseph is too informal and not differential enough, but we're so excited to have you. Can you just tell our listeners a little bit about your story and your background and your interest in law?
Sure. So drunk driving defense is all I do exclusively across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And, I lecture nationally. And I attend multiple different organizational seminars on impaired operation. So I also am the author of the statewide treatise for drunk driving defense and multiple other different publications. I'm so blessed. And I say this, I'm so blessed in so many different ways. I have a staff that is so talented and so enthusiastic. And I get up every morning after 28 years and still enjoy what I do. And in fact, I love what I do. And that's a blessing. How many people get up and think about, the days to retirement or when can I get a new job? And I'm just blessed. I get to help people and better understand the scientific underpinnings of drunk driving defense in a clean, honest way. And it's just a lot of fun to practice law and have that incorporated into what you love to do. And as I say, it's just a real blessing. So about 10 years ago, I began my criminal defense work exclusively in drunk driving defense when I was appointed as chief legal counsel in the statewide litigation against breath testing machines here in Massachusetts in a case known as Ananias. And then RSJC, Commonwealth versus Hallinan, was also involved. So there I am. And so for 10 years, this kind of career case, this odyssey called Ananias, brought me into the breath testing world. And I began to learn more about breath testing than I ever thought I would. And it has really kind of changed the entire landscape here in Massachusetts regarding the scientific understanding of breath testing and, making sure that breath test results in Massachusetts are scientific and reliable. So that's a little bit about my legal background, but I'm also, I don't mind, breaking my anonymity. I am a person in recovery, and I have been for the last 20 years. So although I've just told you how much I love the practice of law, what's the most important aspect of my life is recovery. I attend at least 5 to 6 meetings every single week, sponsor people, but I'm also involved in what an organization we have here in Massachusetts called Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. And it's about addiction, mental health awareness. And it's an organization that's been sponsored by our Supreme Judicial Court, and we're funded by the court to help lawyers who are struggling with mental health, well-being, and probably most importantly, addiction. So that's a little bit about who I am and what I do.
That's so cool. And I will, in doing my homework, I noticed that you are the only attorney in the whole state of Massachusetts who have completed this additional course in alcohol and drugs. I think it's called like the Robert F. Borkenstein course that teaches principles of pharmacology, standards in forensic laboratory, drug advancements. So tell me a little bit about that course and maybe how it enhanced your view of the legal field.
So the Robert Borkenstein actually was the pioneer, the inventor of the breath test machine. Many people claim Borkenstein was the inventor at Indiana University in Bloomington. And so there's 2 separate Borkenstein courses that are internationally known. One is for alcohol and the other is for chemical. Because of my involvement with impaired operation, I had a seat with our House of Representatives, and I was one of the members in the public safety and security with our House of Representatives here in Massachusetts. So as a member of that particular organization, I was permitted to go to the Borkenstein courses. And the reason I give you that little background is because the Robert Borkenstein courses are usually don't permit defense lawyers to attend, but because I had a dual role with law enforcement, they permitted me to enter. And I got a firsthand view, which was, it was, both courses were probably a week long, and then you take an exam afterwards. But you learn more about the scientific underpinnings of impaired operation. And you hear, and you're really, you have the ability to be exposed to some of the cutting edge aspects to how law enforcement tests for breath testing, tests for other type of chemical, and how they enforce the laws throughout the nation for drunk driving and impaired operation. And I want to keep using that phrase, impaired operation, because we're seeing more and more different type of chemical dependence, but also chemical impairment. And that those two worlds, the alcohol and the chemical dependence and the chemical aspect, are becoming more and more prevalent. And in Massachusetts, it's a very difficult crossover for the district attorney's office to prove a chemical induced impairment versus an alcohol-based one. So those two courses were magnificent, and I was privileged enough to attend both of those courses.
Very cool. It's like you're this cool cross between a doctor and a lawyer, like the best of both worlds, really understanding all that behind there. Now,
it was really kind of neat. I wasn't a real science guy in high school, but it was the Ananias case that brought me to try to understand, have a basic understanding of science and how it interplays with the law. And that aspect, as young lawyers are thinking about, the practice, is becoming more and more important. The understanding, whether it's DNA, whether it's fingerprinting, whether it's voice mapping, whatever we're talking about, science is playing a much, much larger role in the courtrooms than it's ever played before.
And you've mentioned the Ananias case a couple times. I'm not familiar with it. For those others not familiar with it, what was the core, I guess, decision that set precedent that's important from an addiction perspective?
Well, I don't know how much it had for an addiction perspective, but essentially Ananias has been a big part of my life for the last 8 to 10 years. And I often say to people, it was one of the most interesting, and it's one of those cases that, as I say, it's one of those career cases that when you're in law school, wow, will I ever be involved in such a case that has such an impact? And I was lucky enough to do that. And the people, the lawyers, the scientists that I was exposed to, that I call friends today, that I can pick up the phone. It's wild. I can pick up the phone and speak to internationally acclaimed experts, and they're on my speed dial. For example, many lawyers or scientists in the realm of impaired operation will know the name A. Wayne Jones, Alan Wayne Jones, the godfather probably of impaired operation testing. There isn't a man, woman, an individual who has done and written more articles than A. Wayne Jones. And so I got to interact with him. I cross-examined him. We've become somewhat friends. I see him at conferences and so forth. But these are the kind of people that I was exposed to. But Ananias, Commonwealth versus Ananias, was a statewide challenge to the scientific reliability of breath test machines here in Massachusetts. We have one kind of breath test machine, and that's produced by a German company, Draeger. And it was about 10 years ago put into question as to whether or not the results of this indirect test, breath to blood, were producing scientifically accurate results. And I was privileged enough to be lead counsel in that case. And I began to learn about the science of breath testing and recognizing that the scientific underpinnings of how a breath test machine works can be challenged. But the main core of Ananias was, I discovered during the litigation that the maintenance and calibration of the machine at our statewide office of the Office of Alcohol Testing was severely problematic. And that particular area was that area of our statewide forensic labs hadn't been accredited. And in fact, it was the only part of our statewide lab that wasn't didn't have a third-party accreditation. So the more I learned about the maintenance and the problematic calibration, the more I recognized that it to be a huge problem. And the court agreed with me. And the case, as I said, took about 8 to 10 years. And as I speak to you today, it's still in the wrap-up stage. But what happened was the 27,000 citizens across the state as a result of Ananias received notices indicating that if they had a conviction based upon a breath test, they had the ability to go back and revisit the legitimacy of that particular conviction. And it's really been magnificent for those who are in recovery, right? So these people who have this beautiful recovery story, but let's say they have, numerous convictions, but they were the result of a breath test. They have the ability now to go back, remove those convictions from their record, and maybe drive again. And I've had to, it's so wonderful to be able to help, people. And in the recovery community here in the Pioneer Valley, Western Massachusetts, I know a lot, and I've been able to help, some people with, 15. And I'll tell you about Ron. Ron is an addiction counselor, and he 20 years sober, 4, maybe 5 convictions. Okay. I was able under Ananias to remove some of these convictions. Wow. And he is an employee with a state agency and has received national awards for his ability to communicate and relate to people in addictions. He's a counselor and he speaks, but he couldn't drive. So Ananias opened the door and gave him the ability to do this. And I was lucky to help him. And that's just a little bit about what this Ananias case, the impact that it's had across the state. And when you drill down, the individual assistance I've been able to give people because of the court orders in Ananias and later on validated in the Commonwealth versus Hallinan by our Supreme Judicial Court.
Wow. It must be so rewarding to know that you were involved and fundamental in a decision that affects so many people's lives in a positive way. Gosh, how rewarding to be able to think, yes, I've not only helped maybe this person in this one case, but all these people whose lives were adversely affected from these decisions. So, one thing this is not a question I had thought of before, but as you're talking, I'm thinking if I was somebody listening out there who knew somebody struggling with addiction, or maybe was struggling and had legal issues as a consequence, I would be thinking to myself right now, oh my gosh, how can I find myself a Joseph Bernard? And if they're lucky enough to live in Massachusetts, they can give you guys a call. But what kind of guidance would you give to folks who maybe have legal issues that are related to addiction and are trying to find someone as knowledgeable and passionate as you are as an attorney?
Well, there's 2 different national organizations I would tell people to look for. The NCDD, National College for Drunk Driving Defense. It was the original. And what people can do is go on their website. And there's also another organization that is equally as good, and that's DUIDLA. Both these national organizations have lawyers who participate in national seminars, are involved in the science, but also are available for hire in your particular state. Both organizations have websites. NCDD, DUIDLA, both have websites, and you can go onto their websites, go onto a map, determine, what lawyers are involved in those organizations and look at their websites, do some research, vet them. But the lawyers who are involved in those organizations, I can tell you, are probably the most talented lawyers with impaired operation cases, bar none. A lot of them just exclusively focus on drunk driving defense. And you're going to find some of the most talented and most reputable lawyers that impaired operation defense can provide. So that's what I would be suggesting. You jump on those websites and they'll give you, and you don't have a lot, but they're out there. And any lawyer who's involved in those organizations deeply cares about the science and to become a better lawyer, better educated, and better equipped to help people.
Okay, that's wonderful. I had never heard of either one of those. So super, super helpful. One of the ways in which I think probably my career and your career are similar is we both come across longstanding misconceptions about the disease of addiction all the time. And I wonder, what are some of the biggest misunderstandings that from an attorney point of view that you see in the legal field, and how do you combat that? How do you challenge that?
So I would say one of the biggest is with whether it's a judge, probation, but the big misconception is the fact that they sometimes these individuals see addictions as an excuse,
Mm.
and they don't have an understanding that, being addicted to a substance isn't by choice necessarily. It's not anything that somebody got up and planned. I'm going to go ruin my life and be addicted and not have particular choices. We know, and you know much better than I, that addiction is a mental disease, and there's different solutions to this, but it becomes impossible to deal with without help. So it's not an excuse. When we hear this phrase, you get caught in the grasp of addiction. I don't know if there's an appreciation for the strength of that particular aspect. These are people, and you know better than I, doctor, who struggle. It's, again, people don't wake up, or as a little boy or girl going to school, I aspire, to be addicted and hurt people and lie and cheat. And this is what the disease of addiction does.
Yeah.
It deludes people into believing, as they're lying, that they're telling the truth. But there is a really, I think, a huge disconnect there. It's becoming better over the last, I would say, 7 or 8 years. But I still, run up with the roll of the eyes with the judge, or, different type of dismissive remarks or sentences that aren't really sensitive to the deep mental problem that people suffer from, as if they, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and stop. Just say no. Well, it's not that easy. And that's the big disconnect.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I think our society in general doesn't understand that the brain is hijacked. Your basic survival instincts of eat, sleep, procreate are literally hijacked, so that the substance.
I love that word.
Yeah, it's hijacked. I mean, you've been hijacked for your survival instincts to a different instinct. And when I do evaluations, a lot of times in medical templates, you'll hear doctors say, well, what's your substance of choice? I hate that, because it's like, to your point, nobody chooses. They're going to go out and do this. So I'll often say, what is your substance of no choice? There's no choice here in that. So yeah, I completely agree there. And addiction treatment in general faces a lot of challenges. I see it from a physician perspective. What do you see as some of the biggest obstacles from a legal standpoint in the field of addiction treatment in 2025?
So there's a couple. But I want to start with the client, right, who's in my office. I'm a lawyer. So one of my big hurdles is the fact that I'm not a physician. I'm not a recovery coach. I'm your lawyer. And the interplay between a recovery program and my representation is very, very important. But I have to have very strict boundaries. I can't become, their physician or their sponsor or anything of that nature. But I will always, my letters, and meeting you and your team, this is a really important part of what we do. We utilize the importance of sobriety and recovery in our interplay with the client, because it can always, at least in Massachusetts, always be of help. It can never hurt. Many clients are under this false belief, well, if I get involved in recovery, it's an admission of guilt. No, wrong. It is not. It has nothing to do with the actual criminal case itself. Where it can help is in my negotiating with the prosecutor, sentencing guidelines, judges, prosecutors, the registry of motor vehicles. The registry needs to feel safe. And if they know that somebody is committed to recovery, not just some lip service, that goes a long way. So there's the interplay. But the problem is getting the client to buy in. And sometimes they just don't. And that's okay. I can't force them to. But the big challenge I have many times is as you just said, hijack. Many clients are, they're a third offender, right? They've deluded themselves into believing I don't have a problem. I can do this myself, whatever, right? And we know that the percentage of people who have been arrested the third or fourth time are probably close to 80 to 90% of people who have addiction problems.
Sure.
And you put those people on a lie detector test, I bet they would pass as they
Right.
saw me and say, I've got this, I don't have a problem. When study after study and the facts say something completely different. So it's that as a lawyer, the challenge of getting people, maybe for lack of a better term, to buy in to the importance of recovery and how it can only help and not hurt. So that's a big challenge. And then of course the next piece of that is getting judges and probation and those entities that deal with sentencing, to also to buy in and have that as a piece of a sentencing, or a prosecutor maybe as a charge concession, if I can show that recovery. So, I do a lot of this across the state, and I will never, ever, recognize a recovery program from a client that I don't think is legitimate, right? We all know those, the box checkers, but when a judge hears me say that I believe this person to be, have a robust recovery program, I think that matters, because as
Yes.
many times I'm in front of a judge, Mr. Bernard, is there a recovery program? Do you have something? I have, and I'll just say, Judge, I have nothing to add. And unfortunately, I think that speaks volumes. But that aspect, right, to the law and recovery, I think can help. The law can actually help. You know better than I. Sometimes it takes forced exposure to a recovery program to really impact the person's psyche. Sometimes people got to get locked up. They do, right? Whatever it takes. Sometimes. But being sensitive to the world of addiction and how it impacts the mind, hijacks the mind. I love that. Is, I think, a very important part of what judges need to be aware of, what probation needs to be aware of, what our legislatures need to be aware of. I have to say this. There are so many different ways I think we could write laws to assist and recognize people who are struggling with addiction, people who might benefit, from a lenient type of sentence if they embark in a life of recovery. These are all ways I think we can help. We have, the legal community, we have this wonderful opportunity to help people who are struggling mightily with disease, with families, right? With professions. I represent doctors, I represent lawyers, law enforcement, pilots, neurosurgeons, and a lot of those people I represent, would benefit, their families would benefit, and the rippling impact of recovery would really make its mark if we all just become sensible with regards to how to sentence, how to charge, and how to actually be of service to our fellow humans.
Gosh, I love that. And it sounds like I love that you take a very critical eye to addiction treatment in a way to say, is this a program that is truly comprehensive and is going to help this person? And, the insight piece is real. I mean, I look at impaired self-insight almost as one of the symptoms of addiction. If you go through the diagnostic and statistical manual, you will not find that, but that impaired insight, or that altered sense of self-awareness where everybody else can see what's going on except the person there. One of the most challenging aspects, like you said, and can really hinder people in their recovery. So, but before we wrap up, what for our listeners today, you've already talked about some positive changes that could be meaningful. For instance, looking at different legislation that instead of being punitive was treatment proactive. I think that's huge. Besides that, what other kind of positive recommendations would you give that you think would either help somebody who is struggling with addiction and needs legal support, or just somebody who wants to better understand addiction from a legal perspective? What advice would you give? And that's kind of intentionally open-ended, but I'm a psychiatrist,
So I don't have to tell you the importance of exposing yourself and educating yourself. Sometimes when you are exposing yourself to a particular area that is maybe challenging or uncomfortable, right? It's okay. And you don't necessarily, I would say to anyone, you don't necessarily have to understand or buy in immediately. But I would say anyone who thinks they might have a particular problem, just start, and try to keep an open mind. And that is easier said than done. But that to me is one of the most, try to keep an open mind and recognize that whether you read, whether you're seeing a video, whether you're speaking to somebody, it's having an impact on you, and be open to it. And I always say to people, nothing changes if nothing changes, and in the world of addiction, that's so important that we've got to recognize that even somebody who has long-term sobriety, what I might have done last year might not be beneficial or sustains my recovery this year. So I'm always looking for different ways and trying to be an active listener to those who have a successful recovery program. Or for example, one of the reasons I was so excited about participating in this podcast is because of you and your enthusiasm. And I have now been exposed for this period of time with you. And I know I'm going to be leaving this experience better than I was when I entered. And that to me is a big part, drip by drip, small by, little steps, and just never give up, right? Never, ever, ever give up. So those are my words of wisdom to whoever's out there struggling or asking questions.
I love that. And ending on a message of hope. There's always hope with addiction treatment. Joseph, thank you so much for joining us today. I really have been looking forward to talking with you on the podcast ever since we met in person. And I know how busy you are, so we so appreciate your time. For those of you listening, if you or someone you know is in need of legal services and you're lucky enough to live in Massachusetts, you can reach out to Joseph's team. It's BernardOIUDefense.com. And then for more information on our Aware Recovery Care in-home treatment, please visit our website, awarerecoverycare.com. We're on all the social medias, TikTok, Instagram, you name it. And be sure to subscribe and stay connected for future discussions in the world of recovery. This has been so fascinating, and hope everybody listening has a great rest of their day.
Thank you.